At this moment, when I'm speaking to you, as hard as it is for me to believe, I'm 90 years old. I never in my life would believe that I would be 90 years old, but here I am, and I've been asked by a lot of people to say things more about my life and stories that I tell, which I've refused to do because though my children and grandchildren know me, probably they're related to you in some fashion, either a grandfather or a great-grandfather or whatever. I've refused because it didn't seem like it was necessary, and I was reluctant to do that. Now that I have great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchild like you, I feel that it might be worthwhile for you to know a little bit more about my life. My parents were very nice, very good. I think that considering that I have two brothers and the three of us have been comparatively successful with what we did, must mean that they knew what they were doing. On the other hand, my father was an accountant. My mother was a mama and horribly conservative Jewish. And all three of us, all three boys, were bar mitzvahed, but religion had absolutely no meaning to me at all. The best story that I can tell about my mother is that she hated the fact that my first wife was an Italian Catholic. And I went to her one day and I said, "Mother, Tina and I are going to be divorced." And her face lit up. I said, "Not only that, I'm getting married again." She said, "To a Jewish girl?" I said, "No." She didn't talk to me for 3 years. That's true, 3 years. You know, my older brother was 5 years older than me. My younger brother was 7 years younger than me. Those are very different periods in one's growing up. So we had contact with each other, obviously, but I think for the most part it was playing with other kids. And because I got involved in music very early, it is a social art, and therefore you spend time with other people. I've often said, someone who I played a lot of music with, if you put us into two separate rooms and locked the doors so we couldn't hear each other, and we each had the same piece to play, and we would start at the same time, we would both walk out and have finished exactly at the same time. It's that kind of intercommunication and sensitivity that makes for music. I played piano when I first began playing. My older brother played violin very well. Unfortunately for him, he was drafted when he was 18 into World War II. He carried through the whole war a rifle in one hand and a violin in the other. And he had gone to Music and Art High School and graduated in 1941. And I entered the high school playing piano. I mean, I actually played a Mozart concerto to get into the high school. And if you entered the high school playing piano, you had to take another instrument. And I said to my brother, they've let me come into the high school. I said, they say I have to play another instrument. What should I tell them? He said, tell them you want to play the oboe. But it turned out to be a good thing for me. I didn't even know what an oboe was. 1929 was the depths of the Depression. In a funny way, which is to my parents' credit, at that age, I had absolutely no knowledge of what a depression was. I didn't even think of it. It had no meaning to me at all. Even now, I have no recollection from that except being a kid, and then going to high school and to college. It's interesting because in recollection, in a sense, I didn't really know my father very well. He was there when we had meals, especially dinner, and other than that was out working. He was an accountant, and it's interesting because his ability with math was absolutely spectacular. That's been passed down to me, my two brothers, and almost all of our children and grandchildren. I remember once sort of making up a game between my older brother, who became a physicist, a nuclear physicist, he and myself, taking numbers 3 columns across and 3 columns down, and seeing who could add them up first correctly. Well, he would go down a column of numbers like this and just write the bottom, which was correct all the time. It's fascinating because that gene really did go through everybody. Math was so simple to me that I certainly didn't have to do any homework. It meant nothing to me. It was all very easy to do. I think still the most interesting math that I did was geometry. Geometry is interesting because it's pure logic. That's all it is. But even in my office, because I did have an office at one time, if I gave my bookkeeper a project to add up or something like that, she'd get the wrong answer. I would have a knowledge of where the answer, the parameter of where the answer should be, and she was writing putting numbers in by pushing keys, but she, of course, did not know what the answer was supposed to be like, and she probably pushed a key at the wrong time or the wrong key, and so she got the wrong answer and lived with it because she thought that was accurate. The truth is, when you have an ability in that area, you really do have an idea of where it's going. So as a course, that was very easy for me to do. Playing the oboe was a very good thing for me. It increased that social activity between people and taught me how to use my head. Going to Music and Art High School was absolutely super for me. And when I graduated Music and Art, which was in '46, I loved chemistry in school also. And I thought either I'd become a chemist of some kind, a chemical engineer, or a musician, depending on where I got a scholarship to. I considered going to, God, what is the college name? That was up right next to Juilliard, CCNY, for chemistry, or to Juilliard, whichever one gave me a scholarship. And I got the scholarship to Juilliard, and that's where I went from 1946 till about 51. It wasn't a bad thing for me, but I was absolutely floored when the president of the school, a rather famous composer, whose name was William Schumann, and the dean, his name was Mark Schubar, actually came to me as I was leaving the school and said that they wanted me to teach there, which I've done, as I said to you before, for about 30 years, from 51 till about 81. Well, in public school, PS 94, I was a little kid. I have here, believe it or not, a report card from there that was nice enough to say nice things about me. I don't even remember which teacher it was, but she said, "He will grow up to be a great man." That's a funny line for a kid. It just happened that I was lucky enough to have 2 friends. We had water gun fights when we were 10, who became rather important in the arts world. One of them is the famous director Stanley Kubrick, and the other is a fellow who writes music and, like myself, played the oboe. His name is Jerry Freed, and when Stanley went to do his first film in Hollywood, he brought Jerry with him to do the music for it. Jerry continued to do that. Even to this day, he's still writing music for TV and regular movies, and still playing the oboe. 2 men riding around a bus in London, and a double-decker bus. And every once in a while, one reaches into his waistcoat, takes out a little bottle, unscrews it, takes a pink powder out and scatters it in the wind. And his friend says, "I say, Bushard, what are you scattering that pink powder about in the wind?" He said, "Protect us against the lions, you know." He said, "There aren't any lions in London." He said, "Damn good thing, powder's not very strong." Playing in high school, in an orchestra, and in various chamber groups was like magic. It was just super. Believe it or not, I was very lucky when I came to Music and Art because it had 5 different oboe players who became the more important oboe players in this country to this day. The last of them was me, and because of my entering school right at the end of the Second World War, many of the, this was not a Music and Art, this is a Juilliard, many of the oboe players there had been in the war, in the army or whatever. And so they were coming back into what they had spent a lot of time in. And therefore, when there were 2 orchestras at Juilliard at that time, one of them was the senior orchestra, and there was a junior orchestra. The first one was conducted by a rather well-known conductor, and all of these guys, because they had that background, came in and played in that orchestra. I came in because I had had mononucleosis late, and as a result, the second orchestra, which was conducted by a man named Edgar Schenkman, needed an oboe player, and I auditioned for him. And because I was the only one that still had not gone into the other orchestra, he hired me. He asked me to play first oboe in that. That's just luck. The oboe, in a sense, controls the wind section in an orchestra. And I loved to play chamber music. And so that opportunity was there and opened up in a lot of different ways. This group that I told you I had formed in '57, the New York Chamber Soloists, performed pretty much everywhere. What was fun to do, since you had talked before about Massachusetts, it happened that I knew the man who put on concerts there, at UMass. And I said to him, again, this was just another different idea. I said, here you have these sister colleges around. I said, why don't we do the complete Beethoven quartets? There are 16 of them. And we'll do 4 in each of 4 different colleges. I said, you can sell them as individual concerts at each place, or one price for hearing the whole series. I said it's a way of expanding students' interest in all of your places rather than just the one that they are working in. And it worked extremely well. I did the same thing in Los Angeles a few years before or after that. Not with Beethoven, but with another composer. And we've actually done that with, there are 6 Brandenburg Concerti by Bach. We've done that in 6 different locations. It has the same magic to me. That program of doing all 6 Brandenburgs in one concert was so successful that we toured France with it. I remember doing it in Berkeley at University of California, 3 successive years, which each sold out. That's pretty good. I asked for a number of friends who were composers to write pieces for us. The guy who was the drummer for Benny Goodman is a guy named Mel Powell. He, in fact, had a piano trio, a jazz trio after that. He's someone who went to school with my wife at Yale. And our harpsichordist, Albert Fuller, knew him very well because they were at Yale at the same time. And I asked him to write a piece. He wrote a piece called 8 Miniatures for Baroque Ensemble. It's very good. And it's amusing because when we first went to Europe for the State Department, we felt it was important to play American pieces. And so we performed that in Paris at the Théâtre d'Élysée. And I don't know if you know the story, but when Stravinsky's Sacre de Printemps, Rite of Spring, was first played in Paris, there was almost a riot in the theater, people shaking their hands and screaming, etc., etc. And we played this piece, and we had a pretty good audience. Someone in the balcony, as we were playing, shook his hand. He said, "Affreux," it means horrible. And I felt I was like Stravinsky to have brought that there. I got to know everybody, and happily they had respect for me. I was really a very good oboe player. What's saddest to me now at 90 years old is that I don't play. I play here with my wife sometimes, but there's no way that I'll get on a stage again. That's a great disappointment. At one point in the last few years, I was in a hospital bed and thought of the four things that mattered to me in my life at this point. One of them was my family, my wife and family. The second thing was playing the oboe, which is no longer there. The third thing was being successful in whatever business I was in. And the last thing was travel. Happily, we still travel. I really do like to travel. And in fact, although there's probably no date on this machine, we're leaving the day before Thanksgiving for Paris. We've gone to Paris and Honolulu twice a year for about 25 years. These two guys are taking a train back into London, and they've just passed Wembley, right? And one friend says to the other, he said, was that Wembley? He said, no, it's Thursday. He said, so am I, let's get off and have a drink. That's very good. Well, I had started this office a long time before that. I can't even give you a date because I'm not sure, but my guess is that I started the office somewhere in the early 50s, and it was very successful. So by the time I stopped doing that, I was representing 13 of the great quartets in the world. Many of the great soloists. I knew everybody who put on concerts throughout the United States, and a lot of the people in Europe. We were very lucky in Europe. We got to meet a lot of different people. In fact, I will see one of those when we go the day before Thanksgiving this year, who probably runs all the music in Paris. His name is Emmanuel Andre. And he runs the Cité de la Musique and pretty much everything else that happens. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there was a big new hall that was built fairly recently in the Cité, and he was involved in making that happen. Interesting man. I mean, the only reason I know him really is because of that business. I've ended up creating a lot of programs and combinations of people. In fact, I don't really understand it, but I seem to have a talent for doing that kind of thing, which most people will tell you who know me. There's a conductor who was a genius trumpet player. His name is Gerard Schwartz. And I had gotten to know Pierre Boulez from Paris for one reason or another, and he was coming to New York to do a Webern concert, and I had hired Jerry to play trumpet in that, and that went so well that Boulez, before he left the New York Philharmonic, had hired Jerry to play first trumpet. Since then, Jerry has gone on to do a lot of different things, including running the Seattle Symphony for about 25 years. He's back in New York right now, and as an example of what I was saying, the two of us have concocted something called the Mozart Orchestra of New York, which has been extremely successful around the country. Again, it consists of an awful lot of people that I know and who know me, and basically we trust each other, which is the name of the game. The business about making programs, though, is so odd, and I still don't understand it. I woke up in Paris one morning and had an idea for a concert, and with this guy, Jerry Schwartz, and came back and told him about it. He loved it also. It was the idea of doing an all-Stravinsky program with a variety of, the whole reason for it was to do the Stravinsky Mass, which most people don't know, including people who sing and people who conduct, etc. It's an unusual orchestration and a piece that sounds absolutely terrific. In a funny way, he used the instruments to make them sound almost like an organ. Instead of the organ pressing certain keys, you actually had the instruments playing. And I thought of it beginning with unaccompanied Stravinsky works for chorus, the octet, which is for 8 different winds, and after intermission, a piece by Stravinsky called a pastorale for soprano and 5 instruments, and closing with the Mass. Now, why at 6 in the morning, having not had anything to do with that when I went to sleep, why that occurred to me, I have no idea. We performed through all of Asia, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, a lot of the Middle East, Lebanon, Turkey, all of Eastern Europe, all of Western Europe, which is marvelous because in an odd fashion, this is good for my great-grandchildren. You don't appreciate the United States till you've traveled the world and seen what other places are like. We played a concert in Mexico City, and it was a program that had an opera by Handel called Acis and Galatea that we had a set made for, a backdrop. It was made by a guy who did backdrops for the Met Opera. And it had to be set up before we could do the performance. We were supposed to do that concert in Mexico City, and we arrived, and the State Department met us. They said, well, the concert's going to be delayed for a day because there's going to be a riot in the streets. That's marvelous. And so I said, you know, this thing has to be set up in order for us to perform. I said, maybe you can get me out to the theater so I can have it put up so that there'll be no problem. Well, we went to the theater. A truck picked me up at the airport, and we passed the most horrible hovels that you could imagine. And I got to the theater. It was all marble and gold. And I thought to myself, how in hell can these two things exist that close to each other? The answer is they can't. That's why there are revolutions all the time there. That was interesting. Yeah. Like I said, seeing the rest of the world is fascinating. Australia's a nice country. New Zealand's a nice country. In terms of stories, there's a famous flute player whose name is Julius Baker. He was teaching at Juilliard when I was teaching there. He was teaching before I was there. Almost every flute player in this country who's in a position of importance was a student of his. He lived down the block from me on West End Avenue in New York. But I knew him for a very long time. And he had told me he was going to be in Europe one year when we were there playing concerts. And I'm sitting in our hotel in Paris, and coming up from the courtyard is a flute part that is from a famous flute solo from Daphnis and Chloe by Ravel. It was etc. And I called downstairs to the desk. I said, is there a Mr. Baker staying here? They said, yes. I said, could you put me through to him? So he picked up the phone. I said, don't you know better than to play Daphnis and Chloe in this hotel on Sunday morning? He said, Mel Kaplan. We flew so much out of Burlington that we got to know the people who ran United Airlines fairly well. And the guy who was the chief guy there came up to me one day. He said, a vice president from United Airlines is here. I said, would you like to meet him? I said, of course. His name was Graham Atkinson, and he was in charge of PR at United. And he came over. We were introduced. He made the mistake of saying to me, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I hate the little planes you fly down to Washington. He changed that within a number of months. Yeah, I was almost embarrassed that I asked for these things that he made. Oh, I said, we've been doing this festival in Vermont, and I've wanted to get into the magazine. The same thing, the next issue of the magazine, we were in that. That was when we were living in Charlotte on this farm. And I had people who I had worked with all the time in New York come up to play. It was basically very successful, but it went bankrupt because of two things. One, it started to rain every summer. That was very difficult because this was a summer festival. And the board made a mistake of hiring too many people technically for selling tickets, managing, etc., and ran out of money. That was a great disappointment. I had great pleasure doing that, and in fact, I ended up meeting personally Pat Leahy and the guy who I've heard just recently relative to this whole thing about impeachment, Welch. I met them both, and in fact, Pat I met because we were doing a piece by Copeland that's called A Lincoln Portrait. And it's basically a sequence of letters that Lincoln had written. And I thought having him do that would be very impressive. It was. And so we got to know each other. I did the same thing, by the way. There's a poem called Take Me Out to the Ballpark, Casey at the back. It was written by William Schumann. The music. And there's a narrator. And I asked Bernie to do that because I figured Bernie from Brooklyn, he at that time he was mayor in Burlington, would be a kick. Interestingly, which is part of the reason, and I probably shouldn't say this, that I would never vote for him for President of the United States, is that he was terrified by what he was doing. He would not say a word unless the conductor poked right at him. Frightened. That's not a good person to be president. I always thought that Grace Kelly was a sensational actress, especially the movie she did with Hitchcock. And when she married the prince in Monaco, shortly after that, I wrote to her and said, the Chamber Solos were about to come to Europe to play concerts everywhere. Why don't we come and play for her? And she was nice enough to write back in boarding school handwriting in green ink and said, yes, why don't you come for me play for me at the Palace? My children swam in the pool with her kids. And we had a very good time with her, so much so that we saw her every year for all those years after that, either at the Palace or in Monaco or in New York, in Paris, sorry, where she and her husband always stayed at the Plaza Hotel there. Nice lady. And we saw her every year till she died in '84. This guy in the club where they say nothing in an English club, a man comes up to me and says, he's reading his newspaper, he says, I say, Lord Eschenbach, he said, do you know Madeline Smythe? And he takes a little black book out of his pocket and he says, why, yes, I do know Madeline Smythe. The guy says, Eschenbotham, do you know Madeline Smythe well? He looks again, he says, why, yes, I know her quite well. I said, Eschenbotham, do you know Madeline Smythe intimately? And he looks again in his book, he said, why, yes, I do know Madeline Smythe intimately. He said, well, I'm Mr. Smythe and I don't like it a bit. And he looks in his book, he said, and I didn't either. We moved to Vermont probably 45 years ago and ended up in Charlotte about 40 years ago on what we made into a horse farm. My wife rode horses when she was a little girl. In fact, you won't know, and the people watching this may not know, but the great equestrian in this country was a guy named Bill Steinkraus, who was the first American to win a gold medal. It was in the Mexico City Olympics. And he and my wife grew up together. She said he was a genius on horses when he was a kid. And she said he had a room full of blue ribbons. She had a room full of red ribbons. And interestingly, most people will be surprised at that if they know Bill Steinkraus. When we formed the Chamber Soloists, we formed it as a nonprofit corporation, and he was willing to be part of the board, which surprised me and was very nice of him. When he died not too long ago, in his will, he actually left funds for the Chamber Soloists. I was absolutely floored by that. I never would have expected it. But he was a nice guy and cared about Inez, who taught him towards the end of his life. Well, having this farm was wonderful. Doing things on it was wonderful. Having a garden was terrific. And as you can see there, I have one of those boxes out there and a part of a garden up there. that gives me a great deal of pleasure. One barn that we built we lived in a barn that was built in 1850 that we made into a house. We had another barn that was near to it that we could put a horse in. So we bought one horse, which lived in that. His name was Justin. His name was Just in Time, but everybody called him Justin. And that seemed so good, both for my wife and for our daughter, who loved doing that also. Now she has a daughter. So my granddaughter is extremely, both of them have stayed in the business in a sense. My daughter runs the equestrian program at UVM, and my granddaughter is down at the University of Georgia right now, again, on part of a team, winning things everywhere. She just called me a little while ago. And so we ended up building an indoor arena. I don't know if you know what they are. It's a building that's about 100 by 40, and that you can exercise horses and practice jumping and things like that. My daughter walked into the room once when Ines and my wife and I were there. She said, "I know what you should do. You should build an indoor arena." I said, "Do you know what an indoor arena costs?" Of course she didn't. It was about $150,000 or something like that. And my wife said to me, "You know, little girls who grow up with horses and care about them make very good wives." And so I did end up building that building. And so after that, we built another building with a barn that took many more horses and another barn that took horses. And when we left, which is not very long ago, well, it's about 40 days ago, someone bought the barn, bought the whole farm, who's in that business also, which I guess gives us pleasure, and my daughter pleasure, to see that somebody has done something with it. It's the last thing in the world I would have ever done, but you go with the flow, right? And they liked it, and I mean, here I have 3 generations who care. In fact, there's a picture in there of all 3 of them on horses. Jonathan really did walk in, which is the reason we're here at this facility, one day and said, "I probably shouldn't say this to you, but you're not getting younger, and you want to be someplace where you're going to be comfortable." And insisted that we look around at various places. This happens to be a very nice place. And recently I was told a wonderful story about this man in Florida who buys a pool to have on his estate. And so that he'll enjoy it, he gets 2 porpoises, which he puts in the pool. And they love it, and he loves having them there. And every night he goes off, because he didn't realize that they were both males and they have a lech for young female seagulls. He goes off to find young seagulls for them. And he comes back to the pool one night, and on his path, there's a lion across the path. He carefully steps over the lion, and as he does, a policeman comes out and arrests him. The question is, what is the charge? The charge is carrying a young gull across a sedate lion for immoral purposes.